The War of 1812. January 1815. The war thus far. Britain and America may have signed a peace treaty at Ghent on Christmas Eve 1814, but until it's ratified by both governments, the war continues. And Britain still has its eyes on New Orleans. But on January the 8th, they suffered defeat in the Battle of New Orleans, a military disaster in the history of a country which has no shortage of them. That's not meant as a wisecrack, but as a statement of fact. Just think of the Charge of the Light Brigade, or Dunkirk, or Singapore. I will cover the Battle of New Orleans in a separate video, but for right now, here's what else happened in the War of 1812 in January 1815. Lots. Today's video is based on the entries for January 1815 in D.R. Westhouse's unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815, but as always, all mistakes are strictly my own. British commander Sir Edward Pakenham had initially wanted to withdraw his troops from their position facing Jackson's men who were dug in along the Rodriguez Canal. He feared his troops would be decimated in a frontal assault on the strong American defenses, which is exactly what happened. Pakenham wanted to withdraw in order to find a better avenue for attacking New Orleans, but British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane strongly disagreed, and Pakenham was left to make the best of a bad situation. On New Year's Day, both sides fight a 3-hour artillery duel, the British having manhandled 14 big guns from the fleet on Lake Bourne to positions in front of the American defenses. Pakenham hoped to make breaches in the American lines. But alas, British fire was largely ineffective, while the Americans were able to destroy or damage the 6 British batteries. By the time Pakenham decides to call it a day, the Redcoats have lost 26 dead and 40 wounded, while the Yanks suffered 11 killed and 23 hurt. The stage is then set for the big battle on January the 8th. But on January the 9th, with bodies still lying on the New Orleans battlefield, the British attacked Fort St. Philip, which guarded the Mississippi approach to New Orleans, 60 miles below the city. 5 British ships, a brig, a sloop, a schooner, and 2 bomb vessels, bombarded the fort until January 18th, but it was newly reinforced, and they only managed to kill 1 American while wounding 7 others. So they gave up and sailed away. But do Britons ever really give up? On January the 10th, they invade Georgia, with 1,500 men landing on Cumberland Island. On the 13th, the energetic Captain Robert Barry will lead an attack on the fort at Point Peter, destroying it and capturing its guns. On January 14th, they attack St. Mary's, Georgia, capturing both ships and stores and, inevitably, burning public buildings. Then on the 15th, the flamboyant George Cockburn arrives to take overall command. The British will consider attacking Savannah or linking up with Marines on the Apalachicola. The Apalachicola River in Spanish Florida, while slaves and Native Americans are encouraged to defect to the British at Cumberland Island. Action now shifts north to Staten Island, New York, where the USS President has been prevented from leaving for the West Indies by a British naval blockade. On January the 13th, the British ships are scattered by a serious snowstorm, and the President makes a run for it, only to ground on a sandbar. After 2 hours, President manages to work free, but is damaged and can only sail at reduced speed. Pursued by 4 British warships, President slugs it out with HMS Endymion, and when Pomone and Tendros join the fray, the American commander, Stephen Decatur, has no choice but to surrender early on January 15th. The Americans have endured 24 killed and 55 wounded, the British 11 dead and 14 hurt, all on Endymion. As for the President, it is taken into Royal Navy service as HMS President, His Majesty's ship President. Talk about adding insult to injury, wow. Yet, all is not quiet on the New Orleans front, as a small group of locals decide to have some fun harassing the British as they withdraw via Lake Bourne. On January 20th, they succeed in capturing an unarmed barge, along with 54 soldiers and sailors, an officer, and a master's mate. Then, on the 22nd, they captured a schooner, a transport, and 3 other vessels, burning the schooner when it is unable to cross a sandbar. These raids so annoy the British that they begin providing their retreating vessels with armed escorts, the withdrawal completed by January 27th. The British had begun evacuating New Orleans on January the 18th, Andrew Jackson sending a small force of dragoons under Major Thomas Hines to shadow them. On the 25th, these troops will skirmish with British soldiers at the Bayou Bienvenu. The Bayou Bienvenu, a minor clash that will be the last battle of the New Orleans campaign. Louisiana men under Major Pierre Lacoste will also approach the British position, but choose discretion over valor and withdraw. But they do manage to capture some stragglers and some escaped slaves. Finally, January 1815 ends in South Carolina. On January the 30th, HMS Hebrus sends a small party to St. John's Island near the mouth of the North Edisto River in order to collect water. American militia land on the island to drive them off, while 3 barges and 75 men under Lieutenant Lawrence Kearney go to cut off their retreat. The Hebrus spots the barges and opens fire, while signaling for her own boats to return, but the Yanks manage to capture the tender, or supply ship, after a fight lasting 1.5 hours. 2 of the 3 British boats make it back to Hebrus, but the third, containing a carronade, 6 brass swivels, pistols, and muskets, is found beached and abandoned. In the end, the Americans take around 40 prisoners. Prisoners, eh? Well, that's one way to emigrate to America. Thus, January 1815 sees continued fighting and perhaps the greatest battle of the entire conflict, even though the War of 1812 is supposed to be over. What will February bring? Peace? Not bloody likely. The War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans, January the 8th, 1815. Following the failure of the January 1st artillery duel with the entrenched Americans, please see my January 1815 video, British Commander Sir Edward Pakenham felt he had no other choice but a full frontal assault on the Yankee defenses and entrenched earthworks on the far side of the Rodriguez Canal, a 10-foot wide moat with 2 feet of water in it. This was a dangerous option, but Pakenham had 8,000 battle-hardened troops, the men who had defeated Napoleon, going up against Andrew Jackson's motley crew of 6,000 Yankees. So it should have worked. Should have worked. Should have. The plan was thus. Under cover of darkness, a force under Colonel William Thornton was to cross the Mississippi and capture the American battery on the other side of the river, preventing it from firing on the advancing British troops, the redcoats then turning the guns on Jackson's men. The main assault featured men under Major General John Keane attacking along the river, General Keane sending Colonel Robert Rennie to take an exposed redoubt on the extreme right of the Yankee position, while Keane himself took the 93rd Highlanders to aid the main attack force under Major General Samuel Gibbs. Poor Pakenham. Poor Pakenham. Alas, the gods of war were against him. First miscue. Thornton's attack force got off late. 8 hours late, according to Kilmeade and Yeager in Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans, and his boats were, again, according to Kilmeade and Yeager, carried 4 miles downriver, so that by the time he landed, the main frontal attack had already begun. Oops. Second miscue, the main attack was also late. Then the 44th Regiment, which was to bring fascines, bundles of sugar cane, fascines that General Gibbs' attack force would use to fill the ditch in front of the American defenses, plus the ladders needed to scale the earthworks. Forgot both the fascines and the ladders. And as the redcoats waited for vital supplies that never came, the fog lifted and Jackson's men opened fire. A redcoat is a vivid target. The overall carnage did not spare the officers. Colonel Rennie was killed soon after his men had stormed the redoubt. In the center, the main thrust under General Gibbs stalled, the men hugging the ground, and when Gibbs came forward to rally them, he went down. Troops under General Keane moved to their right across the front to shore up Gibbs's force, but Keane was also hit and carried unconscious from the field. Finally, Sir Edward himself rode forward to take charge. Suffering a bullet wound to his right arm, he had his horse shot out from under him and was securing another mount when he was shot twice, falling into the arms of his aide-de-camp and dying shortly thereafter. General Gibbs would also die of his wounds the day after the battle. Command then devolved on Major General John Lambert, who attempted to rally the retreating troops, bringing the reserves forward to hold the line. By this time, too late, Thornton's men had succeeded in capturing the battery on the far side of the Mississippi, but the Yanks had spiked the guns, preventing the British from using them. Lambert after talking with his officers and with Admiral Cochrane, decided not to renew the attack, and ordering Thornton to return, asked Jackson for an armistice. Under Andrew Jackson's leadership, his largely volunteer army had, assisted by a number of miscues, defeated the finest soldiers in the world. According to historian Dr. Westhouse, the British lose 291 dead, 1,262 wounded, plus 484 missing. The Americans, only 13 killed, 39 hurt, and 19 MIA. Andrew Jackson will eventually serve from 1829 to 37 as the 7th President of the United States. General Keane would recover from his neck wound and later become governor of Jamaica, as would General Lambert, who also served with distinction at the Battle of Waterloo. The British remain in the vicinity of New Orleans until January 18th, completing their evacuation by the 27th. But they are not gone. Oh no. Oh no. If they can't take New Orleans, perhaps they can take Mobile. Mobile. Thus ends my very quick and dirty summation of the Battle of New Orleans. It is largely based on the account of the battle found in Dr. Westhouse's unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815. But, as always, any errors are strictly my own. The War of 1812. February 1815. The war thus far. After the debacle at New Orleans, the British retreated, but not because they'd given up. They're just trying to find another path to victory. 24 hours after leaving New Orleans, the British land at Dauphin Island in Mobile Bay. Their objective, Fort Bower, which they had attempted and failed to take in September 1814. Please see my September 1814 video. But on February 8th, they land a large body of troops, plus artillery, behind the fort, where it's vulnerable. Over the next 2 days, under heavy fire, the British manhandle their big guns into position. Then Major General John Lambert dispatches Captain Harry Smith under a flag of truce, I keep wanting to say truth, truce, to demand the Yanks surrender. In the words of historian Dr. Westhouse, quote, Colonel William Lawrence, commander of Fort Bower, considers his options and decided the fort was not up to the punishment it would take and the senseless loss of life that would result. End of quote. The 360 Americans surrendered the afternoon of February 11th, vacating the fort and grounding their arms on the 12th. The capture of Fort Bower cost the British 13 dead and 18 wounded. But on Valentine's Day, February 14th, a frigate arrives with news of the peace treaty. Then nothing happens as both sides await confirmation. And when that happens, the Yanks return to the fort and the Redcoats return to England. The last battle in the Chesapeake Theater, the Battle of the Ice Mound, takes place February 7th, when a tender from HMS Dauntless becomes icebound near Taylor Island. A large mound of ice allows local militia to fire on the tender, which surrenders after 2 hours, the militia taking 18 prisoners and capturing a carronade. Adding insult to injury, on February 14th, off the coast of South Carolina, 25 American sailors under Lieutenant Lawrence Kearney used a launch they captured from HMS Hebrus on January 30th. Again, please see my January 1815 video, to capture the tender of another British ship, HMS Severn. Kearney is rather an interesting guy whose later career took him to both China and Hawaii. Please see the link to his biography in the description. The Battle of the St. Mary's River, the last land battle between British and American land forces, takes place in Georgia on February 24th. Westhouse writes that the British wanted to link up with Colonel Edward Nichols of the Royal Marines at Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River in Spanish Florida. Apalachicola. Try saying that fast several times. Apalachicola. Oh, you know what I mean. The British, 52 Marines, sailing up the river in 7 barges and a gig, were ambushed by local militia and patriots from, according to Westhouse, quote, the Spanish Florida incursions of 1812-13. All would have been lost for the British forces, but for the failure of the Americans to block the river with fallen trees and other debris. Casualties mounted as the British slowly pulled back during a running fight. With news of the ratification of the peace treaty, the British pulled away from the area in mid-March. End of quote. Of course, ships at sea know nothing of the peace treaties. On December 11, 1814, the 44-gun USS Constitution sneaks out of Boston Harbor. On February 8th, its skipper, Captain Charles Stewart, learns of the peace treaty from a Russian brig while sailing off the coast of Spain. But as the treaty had not been ratified, and so the war was not really over, the hunt continues. At 1 p.m. on February 20th, about 180 miles northeast of Madeira, Constitution spots 2 strange ships and gives chase, the ships turning out to be HMS Cyane, 22 guns, and HMS Levant, 20 guns. At 6:10 p.m., Constitution caught up to the British vessels, and the fight was on. All 3 ships fired broadsides, but when British fire slowed, Captain Stewart ordered Constitution to cease fire as smoke was making it hard to see. But when the smoke cleared, Stewart fired a broadside into the nearest ship, Cyane, before attacking Levant, or something like that. After a half hour of this, Captain Gordon Thomas Falcon, what a great name for a ship's captain, Gordon Thomas Falcon, was forced to surrender Cyane, Captain Stewart sending an American crew to secure his prize. After making repairs, Levant returned to the fight, but by 9:30, Captain George Douglas was also compelled to surrender. Constitution will take her prizes to Porto Praya in the neutral Cape Verde Islands off the African coast. The butcher's bill, according to Westhouse: Constitution, 6 dead, 9 wounded. Cyane, 12 killed and 26 injured. Levant, 23 dead, 16 hurt. Finally, and staying at sea, on February 26, the American privateer Chasseur Captain Thomas Boyle spots the British schooner St. Lawrence under Lieutenant Henry C. Gordon, 36 miles from Havana. St. Lawrence had an interesting history, having been the privateer Atlas and having been captured by the British off North Carolina on July the 12th, 1813. Chasseur gives chase and at 12:30 p.m. raises her colors and fires at St. Lawrence, who is hobbled when her fore-topmast breaks. Her fore-topmast. At 1 p.m., she also raises her colors and begins firing her stern gun at Chasseur. The Americans think St. Lawrence easy pickings with a mere 3 guns, but as they draw alongside, the British ship opens fire with 10 port guns and lets the Yanks have it. Captain Boyle crashes Chasseur into St. Lawrence and yells for his men to board. And when they do, the British surrender. The short 15-minute fight cost the Americans 5 killed and 8 wounded, including Captain Boyle. The British 6 dead and 17 hurt. The captured St. Lawrence is taken to Havana, and when Chasseur returns to the States on April 15th, captain and crew learn the war is over. Thus, the signing of the Treaty of Ghent doesn't stop the fighting. But how long can it go on? Now that the war is over, how much longer? Well, stay tuned. My primary source for today's video is D.R. Westhouse's unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815, but, as always, any errors are strictly my own. All other sources are listed in the description. The War of 1812. March 1815. The war thus far. March 1815. The War of 1812 is well and truly over. The treaties have been ratified. La guerre est finie. But still, fighting persists. Oh well, soldiers and sailors will be, soldiers and sailors. On February 20th, USS Constitution captured the British ships Cyane and Levant. Please see my February 1815 video. And took her 2 prizes to the Cape Verde Islands, arriving at Porto Praya on March the 10th. On March 12th, in foggy weather, a ship is seen approaching the harbor, and a few minutes later, 2 more vessels appear. The Constitution's captain, Charles Stewart, reckoning the vessels to be British warships with no intention of respecting the port's neutrality, quickly departs, taking Cyane and Levant with him. They make sail 4 minutes after the second sighting. The mystery ships turned out to be HMS Leander, 58 guns, HMS Newcastle, 50 guns, and HMS Acasta, 50 guns. The very ships that had blockaded Constitution at Boston before she managed to escape. So they're pissed. Constitution quickly pulls away, but realizing Cyane was coming in range of the British guns, signals for her to tack away in order to escape, which she does successfully, arriving in the USA on April the 10th. Alas, Levant is not quite so lucky. Unable to escape, she fled back to Port-au-Prince, hoping the British would respect its neutrality. They didn't. Instead, they entered the port and began bombarding Levant until after 15 minutes she surrendered. As for the Constitution, Old Ironsides herself, she managed to escape to Puerto Rico, arriving on April the 28th to learn the war was finally over. Sticking at sea on March the 16th, Lieutenant John Hulbert, sailing south off the Georgia coast in gunboat 168, spies HMS Erebus. Erebus, 18 guns. Erebus at anchor by the shore, but sees no reason to avoid her. Hey, the war was over, right? 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 Besides, he was carrying dispatches intended for British Vice Admiral George Cockburn. Although, why an American ship is carrying British dispatch... never mind. Alas, Erebus didn't get the memo. She is seen following the gunboat at 3:30 p.m. and around 4:10 raises her colors and fires a shot. Hulbert also raises his colors but continues on his way. This leads to a second shot, insults, and a demand for surrender. The British even send a boat to take Hulbert to the captain of the Erebus, David Ewan Bartholomew. David Ewan Bartholomew. Hulbert demurred, so the British opened fire, damaging the gunboat's sail and rigging. Fearing an unnecessary loss of life, Hulbert surrenders. In surrendering, Hulbert attempts to give his sword to Bartholomew, but after what Westhouse describes as, quote, some difficult conversation, end of quote, he instead receives an apology and is allowed to continue on his way. So just what the actual hell was that all about? Dr. Westhouse provides a potential clue. Quote, interestingly, 1 month before the official declaration of war, Lieutenant Hulbert, in the very same gunboat, had had an altercation with a British vessel, Sappho, 18 guns, at the harbor of Fernandina, Spanish East Florida, on 15th May, 1812. End of quote. So was that payback or tit for tat or what the hell? By the way, Wikipedia says that the second shot fired in this engagement was supplied by gunboat 168, firing across the bow of Erebus, and that the shots of both Erebus and 168 were the last two shots fired during the War of 1812. I don't think that's true, but I put a link to the Wikipedia article in the description for you to check it out and make up your own mind. Finally, on March 23rd, USS Hornet, 18 guns, Captain James Biddle, arrives at Tristan da Cunha, a small island in the South Atlantic, but before they can drop anchor, they espy a sail on the horizon, a sail which turns out to be the British sloop Penguin, 16 guns, and they head out in pursuit. When Captain James Dickinson of Penguin notices he is being followed, he turns to engage, raising his colors and firing a signal gun at 1:40 p.m. Hornet raises her colors and answers with a broadside. For 15 minutes, both ships slug it out with broadsides before, in the words of Dr. Westhouse, quote, they become fouled in each other's rigging. End of quote. The Hornet's crew wait to repel boarders from penguins, boarders which don't come. Instead, the ships separate, Penguin losing most of her rigging and damaging her mainmast. Towards the end of the fight, Captain Dickinson is killed, command devolving on Lieutenant James MacDonald, who, given the damage to Penguin, decides to surrender. The short 30-minute exchange cost the British 14 dead and 28 wounded, the Americans 2 dead and 11 hurt, including Biddle apparently. The badly damaged Penguin is set on fire and scuttled. Hornet is soon joined by Peacock, 22 guns, and Tom Bowline, 12, with whom she had eluded the British blockade. The three ships had agreed to rendezvous at Tristan da Cunha. They had hoped to make contact with USS President, which had also run the blockade, but she had been captured on January the 15th. So, please see my January 1815 video. January 15th, 1815. Tom Bowline will convey the British prisoners to Rio de Janeiro, while Hornet and Peacock continue hunting. Thus, the war goes on. Stay tuned. My primary source for today's video is D.R. Westhouse's unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815. But, as always, any errors are strictly my own. The War of 1812. April 1815. The war thus far. April 1815. The War of 1812 has been over nearly 2 months, but still, fighting persists. Oh well, ships at sea don't know the war is over, do they? No radio, no internet, no phones. Besides, it's a last chance to score some booty. Some booty. So, what happens this month? In my March 1815 video, we covered the destruction of HMS Penguin by USS Hornet, Captain James Biddle. So, please check out my March 1815 video. Unable to rendezvous with USS President, which had been captured on January 15th, please see my January 1815 video, Hornet and her hunting partner Peacock head to the East Indies in search of prey, of booty. There on April the 27th, the hunting partners see a strange sail and give chase. At 3:30 p.m. the next day, Peacock is close enough to discover the stranger to be a British ship of the line, and the hunters suddenly find themselves the hunted. The stranger turned out to be the 74-gun Cornwallis, and by 9 that night, Captain Biddle of Hornet determined that the British vessel was gaining on him. Biddle figures his only chance of escape is to lighten his ship. So, according to historian D.R. Westhouse, he has his crew throw, quote, 12 tons of ballast, shot, spars, anchors, and cable, end of quote, into the sea. But it doesn't work. By 7 a.m. on the 29th, I presume that's the date, Cornwallis is within firing range, so Biddle gets rid of his remaining anchors and throws more heavy stuff overboard, which works for a while, but by 11 a.m., Cornwallis is back within range. Westhouse writes, quote, Biddle had no choice but to throw overboard all the remaining guns, save one, all the remaining shot, all the spare spars, and everything that remained on deck. End of quote. Well, that works, and by April 30th, Hornet is finally able to get away. But with only one gun and no anchors or boats, her hunting days are over. Hornet arrives at San Salvador, Brazil on June the 9th, where Biddle and crew finally learn the War of 1812 is over. Biddle himself will ask for an inquiry into his conduct during the engagement, but despite the loss of equipment, he earns praise instead of condemnation. James Biddle, who, as a young man, had been imprisoned by the Barbary pirates, would go on to have a long naval career. He would die in 1848, aged 65. The primary source for today's account was D.R. Westhouse's unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815. But, as always, any errors are strictly my own. The War of 1812, May 1815. The War Thus Far. In my February 1815 video, I reported that the Battle of the St. Mary's River in Georgia on February the 24th, 1815, was the last land battle between British and American land forces during the War of 1812. But was it the last land battle period? Not so, according to historian D.R. Westhouse. Instead, the last fight was the ominously named Battle of the Sinkhole. Battle of the Sinkhole on May the 24th. Today's video is largely based on Westhouse's account in his unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions 1812 to 1815. But, as always, all errors are strictly my own. Like ships at sea, it took a long time for news the war had ended to reach the Old Northwest. But when it finally arrives in April at Fort McKay, located at Prairie du Chien in present-day Wisconsin, British Captain Andrew Bulger, Bulger, summons his Native American allies to give them the news and convince most of them to ratify the treaty. Peace is good, right? Right? Well, Sauk Chief Black Hawk didn't agree. According to Westhouse, quote, a distraught Black Hawk declared his people would never be happy and stormed out of the proceedings, leading a war party down the Mississippi River. End of quote. Note, writing in the January 2021 issue of Military History, Douglas L. Gifford says that Black Hawk's resistance was also motivated in part by a desire to revenge the murder by settlers of a young man he had adopted as a son. On the morning of May 24th, Black Hawk and a companion attacked two settlers on horseback, killing one. Then, near Fort Howard, a settler-built fort west of the Mississippi floodplain, near present-day Old Monroe, Missouri, his warriors ambush 5 Americans returning to the fort and kill 4 of them. Note, the men who were ambushed were Missouri Rangers. Missouri Rangers. According to Douglas Gifford, quote, "These were active duty volunteers, not militia called up during an emergency. The government recruited them primarily from French settlements within Missouri Territory. Rangers were responsible for providing their own horses, weapons, ammunitions, and rations, and were, in theory anyway, to be reimbursed by the federal government." End of quote. Bet they never saw a penny. Hearing the shots, a party of 40 Rangers under command of Captain Peter Craig chased the warriors, who numbered around 30 men, to the top of a limestone bluff overlooking the Mississippi floodplain, where fighting became intense. When 20 Rangers from nearby Fort Independence, under Captain David Musick, joined the affray, Black Hawk and 20 warriors take refuge in a large sinkhole. Ranger John Shaw would describe the sinkhole thus, quote, "The sinkhole was about 60 feet in length and from 12 to 15 feet in width and 10 to 15 feet deep. Near the bottom, on the southeast side, was a shelving rock under which perhaps some 50 or 60 persons might have sheltered themselves." End of partial quote. This sinkhole sounds quite similar to Fish Creek, the ravine where Métis hunters held off Canadian militia during the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. In both cases, the defenders were largely invisible, while the attackers would be shot the moment they showed themselves. According to Westhouse, the warriors lose 5 dead, along with an unknown number of wounded, while 13 Americans are killed, 3 injured. At nightfall, the Rangers return to Fort Howard, after it is approached by a small group of warriors, a diversion that allows Black Hawk to retire under cover of darkness. As Prairie du Chien was to revert to the Americans, the British burn Fort McKay on May 24th, the same day as the Battle of the Sinkhole, and then they leave. Most of the tribes will sign peace treaties with the United States and move west of the Mississippi, but Black Hawk holds out until 1816, when, according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, quote, "He finally negotiated a treaty with the American government in 1816, reaffirming the terms of the 1804 Treaty of St. Louis. End of quote. And in 1832, he will return to the warpath in the conflict that has gone down in history as Black Hawk's War. On my desk, I have the Penguin Classics edition of The Life of Black Hawk. I also have Geronimo's story of his life. I know, different era, different war. I've always intended to read Black Hawk's autobiography, as he was an active participant throughout the War of 1812. So my question for you, dear listeners, would you be interested in a review of the autobiography on this channel? A review of the Geronimo book as well? Both? Then let me know in the comments below. The War of 1812. June 1815. The last battle of the War of 1812. Peacock versus Nautilus. On June the 30th, 1815, the sloop of war, USS Peacock, 22 guns, arrived at the Straits of Sunda, between the Indian Ocean and the Java Sea, where she encountered the East India Company bark Nautilus, 14 guns, under Lieutenant Charles Boyle. Boyle sent his ship's master and another crew member in a boat over to Peacock, only to see them, via spyglass, grabbed aboard and hustled below decks. Didn't the Yanks know the war was over? Around the same time, a second boat bearing Mr. MacGregor, the master of the port of Angier, came aside Peacock, and he too was taken prisoner. If anyone had told Captain Lewis Warrington of the Peacock that the war was over, he either didn't believe them or didn't care. The Nautilus then came within hailing distance of Peacock, and Lieutenant Boyle hailed that the war was over. Warrington's response: "Strike your colors and surrender your ship." Yeah, right. And the fight was on. In the action that follows, the British suffer 6 dead and 8 injured, including Lieutenant Boyle, who loses a leg to a 32-pound shot. The Americans will have only 4 or 5 hurt. So, just what the actual hell was this all about? I think I shall leave the last word to historian D.R. Westhouse, whose unpublished The War of 1812, a chronology of the military actions, 1812 to 1815, greatly helped in facilitating the month-to-month videos on this channel. Thanks, David. Westhouse writes, quote, "The day after the 15-minute battle, officials from Angier provided proof that peace had been signed and that the treaty had also been ratified. The last battle of the war was fought on the high seas 188 days after the signing of the peace treaty and 132 days after it was ratified. That made the battle in contradiction of the treaty, which stated, in Article 2, that all hostilities should cease in all other parts of the world after 120 days, which meant that the battle occurred 12 days after the specified limit. Captain Lewis Warrington returned home on October 30th, and despite the controversial nature of his encounter with Nautilus, continued to serve and had a long service with the United States Navy." End of quote. In fact, Warrington continued to serve until his death in 1851, and briefly held the post of U.S. Secretary of the Navy in 1844. Note: writing in the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute, Lieutenant Commander Thomas J. Cutler, U.S. Navy retired, writes that Warrington noticed that Nautilus was heading towards a nearby British fort, whose guns could provide her extra protection. Unsure if the war was truly over, Warrington, as a compromise, demanded the East India ship surrender, and when she refused, Powie! And that's it. The last military action related to the War of 1812. Amazingly enough, since 2022, we have managed to document the 3 years of the War of 1812, month by month. Now that la guerre est finie, I'm going to concentrate on reviewing books about the war and exploring related topics. So if you have any ideas of subjects you would like me to cover, please tell me about it in the comments and stay tuned. If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. And while the war may be over, there's still a lot of learning to do. I hope you enjoyed the War of 1812. But the peace will be even better. Cheers.